It is a pleasure to welcome to our gathering today Reverend Dr. Steed V. Davidson. Steed is a good friend. I would almost describe him as good friend plus, sometimes my nemesis, but always my friend. Steed hails from the island of Tobago, and from there he candidated for the ministry of the Methodist Church in the Caribbean and the Americas. Following his time at United Theological College in the West Indies, he served in the island of St. Vincent, and from St. Vincent, he went to Tobago, right, Steed? Following his time in Tobago, Steed went to study at Boston University. And from Boston, he went on to lecture at the Lutheran Seminary and is now at McCormick University, where he is the vice president and dean. And it's therefore my joy to welcome him to this time and to invite him to make his presentation to Steed. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, for the invitation, for the introduction, for the warm welcome, and for the years of friendship. Yes, as you have indicated, we hold each other accountable in this very strong and loving way. I want to just take a brief moment to greet my sister, my longtime friend, my longtime working colleague, Kathy Gale, who's over there in Wales. Hope to see you soon. And I'll let Paul give you some of those details as to when we may be able to connect. So today we're going to be looking at under the topic, sexuality, gender, and the Hebrew Bible. And for some of you, this may not be a new conversation because conversations like these have been going on for centuries. And then, of course, in more modern times, the conversations have been occurring in different ways as the issue of same gender loving, same sex types of relationships have taken on different contours within our society and certainly within the church. And part of what the church has been asked to do is in some ways to authenticate and say yes to the kinds of demands that human beings have been exercising for centuries. And so this is always an interesting and intriguing thing because many, many times within the context of the church, we believe as if we are doing some groundbreaking work, when actually what we're doing is catching up with where people and human lives have already gone and have been living for centuries. In fact, where the life has already been from the very beginning. And to set the parameters for this conversation, we're just looking at the Hebrew Bible. There are several other passages and places in the New Testament we can be looking at, but that may be for another conversation. But to raise questions regarding sexuality and gender within the Hebrew Bible, I thought of this idea that it amounts to questioning a suspect who was not present at the scene of the crime. Someone who perhaps has some insight into the crime, has some knowledge about maybe the perpetrators of the crime, but they weren't there. They didn't see the thing happen, right? And of course, please don't hear me saying that the issues of sexuality and gender within this context are criminal. But several of the questions that we are asking in some sense makes no sense to the biblical material that we have available to us, because they don't set out to be a manual for sexuality and gender. They don't set out to say, here is what you do and what you should not do. They don't set out to talk about the expressions of sexuality and gender in the ways in which we experience and live them out in the modern day. And that's an important thing because all of our conversations, all of our expressions of gender and sexuality have matured over the years and over the centuries. As human society has evolved, we have been doing and saying and feeling and expressing and living into very different realities. At best, what we get from the Hebrew Bible are insights that we could construct from narratives and some of the cultural presuppositions of the world within which the Bible is set. And sometimes we can draw inferences from these. In a few instances, we might be able to come up with some didactic points as well. But one of the fundamental things that underlines what I'm presenting to you today is this notion of a presumption of a heterosexual construct. There are several people who talk about this, one of whom uses the term heterosexual contract. And that is Monique Wittig, a French philosopher, who more or less makes the point that Western society and other several human societies have operated under this notion of a heterosexual contract. I prefer the notion of a heterosexual construct, primarily because in some sense what it does, it assumes that the organization of the society in the ways in which we think about it is natural. And then we add on to that within religious sphere that is divinely ordained. When instead what has happened is that there is a language that's being used to create what seems to be normative. And this is an important thing for us as we engage with the biblical text, because we can see where the biblical text makes the assumption as to that heteronormativity is in some ways either natural or so natural that it aligns seamlessly with the divine will. So one of the places where we encounter this, of course, is going back to the beginning. And by beginning, I mean how the biblical text imagines the beginning, because that's certainly, Genesis is not certainly the first book written. Because if we look at other earlier materials than Genesis, we are seeing certain types of behaviors related to men and women and the ways in which men, women, and other different types of people engage in sexual activity or even their gender expression. And by this, I would encourage you to read the book of Judges, because that's among some of the earliest biblical material that we have, and the kinds of presumptions that we have there. And I'll come back to this in a while. But nonetheless, one of the sort of go-to places for most persons to try to make sense of gender and sexuality is the book of Genesis and the two creation stories. And the first creation story, of course, sort of makes it clear for many people that God creates human beings. God creates human beings in God's image, male and female, which is Genesis 1, verse 27. And then the verse following chapter 28, in verse 28 says, therefore God says, go, be fruitful and multiply. And so here is a coincidence of several different things that we see. One, it's the sort of a sexual binary that is talked about, male and female, and that sexual binary seems to be equated with the image of God. And then the purpose of those two things now seem to be procreation. So all of this, and you'll hear a number of people making this argument that all of this is natural, that sexual binaries are natural and obvious and necessary for procreation. Sure, that argument is not incorrect. What seems to be forced, though, is when you say that that's the only way, the sexual binaries are only for this, therefore procreation can only be for this purpose, the divine image is only this way, and to the exclusion of all other types of either pairings or relationships or purposes for sexual activity and sexual expressions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the kinds of things that come about and that result from what we can call what I'm calling the heterosexual construct, that there are no other forms of sexual expressions and other than for the purposes of procreation. Of course, one of the things that we pay attention to in reading Genesis chapter 1, is the fact that it is a narrative that is set within the dawn of creation. It is a narrative that in some ways is trying to tell us there is nothing else around. So therefore, you could appreciate why procreation becomes a very high value in Genesis chapter 1. And that high value isn't being presented as normative. And of course, we have found ourselves in a lot of difficulty reading and making a lot of Genesis chapter 1 normative, because some of it may just well be for that time. That's how we understand the early stages of creation. These are the kinds of things that you do, because we have discovered within our human existence, if we don't pay attention to population sizes, then we may run into some problems in terms of what's going on with the resources of the earth. If we don't pay attention to the kinds of extractive and dominating relationships we have over human beings have over creation, that creates problems. So to argue procreation as an exclusive activity that is representative of sexual binaries or any kind of sexual activity is deeply problematic. And of course, here's the other one where that is allied with the divine image. Of course, one of the things that you will see in Genesis chapter 1 is that all of the other creatures were made male and female, were also told to be fruitful and multiply. But they were never talked about as being part of the divine image. In other words, how can you argue that because there's a sexual binary in humans, it represents God's image, but still deny that same divine image to the animals as well. So there's some weaknesses there. But the second creation story in Genesis chapter 2 is another go-to place. And this story, of course, takes place in the garden. And it's a different scenario than the cosmic setting of chapter 1. And in this garden story, it features a man and a woman that we have come to talk about as being called Adam and Eve. The presumption again follows on from chapter 1 and verse 27, that the sexual binaries and pairings, of course, are natural. Because again, this is the way it goes. You see what's happening in Genesis chapter 1, male and female, and voila, by chapter 2, just a few verses later on, you're getting a male and female pair as well. But it's important to note the progression of events in this creation story. Unlike chapter 1, only a single creature is made, right? So there was this human beings, male, female in chapter 1, but in chapter 2, there's one. And several scholars will contend that person does not have a name. That person's name is not Adam. At best, we know the person should be referred to as Adam, right? Adam is what we are told it's called, reflecting the relationship of the Adam out of the Adamah. Adamah being the Hebrew word for the ground. So rather than a person named Adam, a number of biblical scholars have argued what you have is an Adam, which is equal to earth creature, the thing drawn out of the ground. A solitary human that lacks companions. And of course, the writer of Genesis chapter 2 is unafraid to talk about theology in an experimental way. Because what we see is God does not have a plan. God makes a creature and then says, wow, you are alone. Let's find something. And then there are these false starts to try to fill that need. And when that occurs, when the companion is found for the Adam, here is what we find occurring. We find the word Isha, woman entering into the narrative. Now you could check Genesis chapter 2. All of this time, what you basically have is the word Adam. Problem is that our English translations are going to render that word either as the proper name Adam, or they're going to make it the man. But the Hebrew is never the word for man, which is ish. The Hebrew word up until this point is always Adam. It's at verse 22 with the creation of the woman that the word Isha enters. And just like the relationship of the Adam and the Adamah, we're going to see here the relationship of the Ish and the Isha, the man and the woman. There is this argument, or this view rather, among several scholars. At verse 22, that's where you had gender differentiation occurring for the very first time in the narrative. Because you cannot, if all you have is a creature, whatever that biological makeup of that creature is, that creature by itself cannot be gendered or sexualized. It is only in relation to another, and perhaps opposite or what different in some way, that you can start to now talk about the constructs of gender and sexuality. So before then, there's nothing that makes this, that gives a priority to a man per se. And later on, it's when you have now the splitting taking place. Now, there's a number of different issues that will come up as a result of the ways in which some persons read this and interpret this particular creation of gender here. One I'll get back to in a bit. But the opportunity it gives us is that it shows us that the issue precisely of gender is a social construct. And by social construct, I am talking about it makes sense in the context of community and society. So prior to this, to verse 22, it doesn't happen until there are now two creatures, and those two creatures are in some ways different from one another. Sexual binary as an exclusive feature of the image of God can be a way to lock us into this thing called gender complementarity. And gender complementarity is in some ways a problematic conception. In Genesis 1, this link between sexual binary and the image of God is raised. And it's a way to lock it in. But it is not so much about these two equal parts being complementary to each other. There are ways in which gender complementarity creates this hierarchy as well. And what it does, it then starts to read the priority of the man created first in Genesis 1. Yes, God made them male and female. And it also reads the priority of the man created first in Genesis chapter 2, and a whole number of other things. And that the woman then becomes secondary to complement and do all of these other kinds of things. What happens when we start to disinvest our minds of a heterosexual construct to read these two chapters of Genesis? It will be a very important and interesting exercise, because more often or not, what we're trying to do is to read to find ways within which we could reaffirm what we believe to be natural. And in many instances, when reading the biblical text, particularly in our day, when we're reading it alongside of information, data, studies, scientific research, or personal testimonies that says, no, my gender expression is a natural expression. We ignore all of that and go back saying, no. this is what happens. I'm seeing a man and a woman. This is what I want. And in many ways, you see what it is we want to see because we have constructed our society based upon these presumptions, that they're of particularly a presumption of heteronormativity. Yeah. As I make this claim, in the back of my head will be some people who would say, well, I have a passage here to show you, because if you think that that's what God was doing in chapter 1 is to opening up the floodgates for any different things, what do you make of Leviticus 18? Okay, all right. So then let's turn to Leviticus 18, which is one of the more clear prohibitions against certain types of sexual activities that we could find in the Hebrew Bible. It's a very slippery set of prescriptions in chapter 18, because chapter 18 now of Leviticus is concerned with various types of sexual activities, and it tries to regulate sexual activities. One of the things that I hope you notice when you read Leviticus 18 is how polemical it is. And by polemical, I mean, it basically looks at everybody else and says, they are awful people and we are better than them. We will not be like them. Now, I'm not too sure why it is that there are human societies that believe that they somehow can rise above certain types of behaviors and traits. Because there is some special power given to make you not like that. I have this gripe when I hear cities talk about themselves, oh, the people here are strong. I mean, I don't know. I've not traveled everywhere in the world, but I don't know of places where you go and hear people just, something happens and they just like, oh, we're in despair. Everybody wants to improve their life. Everybody tries to be as resilient as they possibly can. Everybody, as far as they're able, every community tries to pull themselves together and get back up. So anyway, that's one of the things that you should notice about Leviticus 18. This sense that there is a kind of a moral taint in every other community, and Israelites, you should not be like them, and you shouldn't be doing all of these awful things. Now, one of the things we don't know too well about Leviticus 18 is whether or not the prohibitions against these types of sexual activities, which of course largely fall along preventing relationships with blood relatives, whether or not those are informed by some of the kind of a biological anxieties that we would have today. We're not clear whether that's what informs them. And if that is the case, the question we have to ask is, well, what do the ancient Israelites know that the Egyptians didn't know, that that the Phoenicians didn't know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know that what you're seeing there is a uniquely informed position. There is always some sense within which communities will regulate sexual behaviors. But and we get down to verse 22 of chapter 18, which is where same-sex male relations are prohibited. And that's part of the list. But I want to point out how the restriction here is on the male rather than the man. And by that I mean, the word that we're seeing in the verse is male on male rather than man on man. And it is not as if this can't be done, because we've seen language to use the word ishar or ish or whatever it is that would be done in the Hebrew. The specific thing here is to prevent males. This very generic, sort of a broad category to cover everything. In other words, what seems to be evident here is not some of the things that we would regard as, male on male sexual attraction, male on male erotic relationships, or romantic relationships, but just eliminating, don't have any sexual relationships at all, none whatsoever. That seems what's clearly there. But when you look at it also, and you drill down on it, you notice that there is no absence of a prohibition against women. this legislation only addresses males and males of a certain status. Now, one of the detours that the chapter makes is in verse 23, where it then just says, here's a caution against women about not lying with animals. Other than that, its audience is a particular social class of men. And what this does is to open our eyes to the fact that a set of male values guides the organization of these biblical texts. Because in many ways, male sexual prowess is what's being protected here. The blindness to the possibility of female and female sexual relationships may very well indicate that may have been seen as non-consequential and not having the same sort of impact as with men who then have a greater level of power. Well, part of the thing to ensure procreation, so that it's one of the big purposes that we see that might be coming out here is, let's make sure that all of the sexual activity that we permit, and we have to go through the whole chapter, would be those that could result in human creation. And again, like I said, I don't know clearly whether they had the biological insight to regulate close blood relationships to prevent the offspring coming from that way. But one of the things that the chapter is interested in is to promote all kinds of activities that will result in acceptable procreation and to disallow all that will not do it. An important thing to, of course, recognize is the high value that the society gives to the male procreative capacities. Men were seen as the procreators. And these are the values you see in these genealogical lists in most of the Bible, and particularly in Genesis, where you'll get the genealogical list, where all you will have are a list of men and the children that they make. And the way in which that verb is used in the Hebrew, it gives the primary active function to the man. There are only one or two exceptions where you will see a woman being mentioned in those genealogical lists of producing these children. And it's because the man and his seed were seen as the active agent, and the woman and her womb were these passive recipients within which the seed grew. Now, of course, you could see the anxieties around this later on in the book of Genesis with Judah's son-in-law, Onan, Judah's son, Onan, who then engages in this act of spilling his seed on the ground during sexual activity, and the fact that this valuable thing is now being spilled and wasted on the ground. In a culture where procreation is a high priority and male virility is a high priority, anything else that in some ways takes away and diminishes from the sexual prowess of a man is a potential threat. The evidence of that sexual prowess is in children. It's not what he does behind the doors, how well he performs, all of these other things that one will want to think about. But what are the children? How many children are there that provides that particular type of evidence? So that a set of values have emerged that promote that as the outcome, as the high value. And then here are these activities and here are these dispositions that need to fall fall into place as a result. Now, it's within this context that I want us to hear and understand two passages that are fairly similar in the plot device and outline, although they lead to very different outcomes. That is Judges chapter 19 and Genesis chapter 19. And these both involve near incidences of male rape, where the technique of raping a man became a device to destabilize a man's sexuality or a man's being and personhood. And so male rape within this context that values masculinity, has a high value on masculinity, is a way of emasculating a man, and in some ways unmanning him. And in the two passages we see this. In Genesis, in the case of Sodom, what we see is this characterization that all the men of the city participated. And so I give you the reference in verse 4 of chapter 19, and notice how the description there of the participation. So you have to imagine if we had to take a heterosexual construct to this, that these men who are in some ways expressing or perpetrating the desire to have sex with a particular man, we have to think that the entire city has now just somehow gone off the rails. That's with reading it from a heterosexual construct. If we remove that construct from our minds, then we have to ask ourselves, what happens? What is this? Where there is just no room for any departure, where every single person in a city are in lockstep in a particular action. There are many places where that kind of a thing happens, and it would raise questions in our minds that what we're seeing here is not just simply, as has been characterized, this passion for men, right? Because if presumably all of the men in the city had that particular orientation, they would have all been in some ways paired up or satisfied or whatever it is, and would not necessarily be as thirsty when a stranger comes in. So there are a number of things that are just wrong about the ways in which we have been encouraged to read and to think about this chapter. And we have a similar set of issues and devices in the plot in Judges chapter 19 as well. Now, Judges chapter 19 ends differently in that the mob ends up raping the man's concubine, for want of a better word, because the relationship is a little bit off there. But anyway, it's his woman. He comes in the city with her, and she now then is gang raped by this mob through the entire night. One of the ways we have to think about this is to see how sexual violence, right? Because this is the incidence of sexual violence that we're seeing here. How sexual violence represents parts of what are in some ways normative culture. That is to say, men have the high value, the women don't. And in this hierarchical culture, where men are on top and women are below, one of the ways to emasculate the man is to put him in the position of a woman in order to emasculate him. And that's what the sexual activity is designed to do. And the forced and violent sexual activity is designed to emphasize that even further. That they failed in that attempt. And the next best thing available to them was to rape the woman. But in raping the woman, they are not necessarily satisfying any kind of sexual passion. What they're doing is achieving partially what they set out to do, that is to emasculate the man. Because this man now, this woman now is his property, is his extension. It's him in some ways. Getting at her, they get at him. There are several issues around the privileges that men have at their disposal sexually that are exposed within these two passages. Of course, hopefully, one of the things that we have discovered by now is that the sense of outrage over that there's a divine outrage over a city that has this free-flowing culture of male-on-male homoerotic relations cannot be sustained in the Bible. One of the reasons why I always like to bring these two together is to point to the different divine responses. So the conclusion tends to be, well, God was so angry with Sodom and the display of male-on-male sexual thirstiness that God destroyed the entire city. But we have a similar display in Judges 19, and there's no divine destruction. In fact, one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is, we have a woman raped for hours, and there's no divine intervention. There's no divine outrage. So that if there's a sense within our own minds that there is a moral compass that the divine is following, then it's hard to argue for it being followed in the way in which you like it in Genesis, and then be very casually accepting of that compass falling away in Judges 19. The outcome of Judges 19 is gruesome. I mean, I constantly ask people who read these two passages, or even just Genesis, did you notice? You are saying that this thing is awful and wrong. But did you notice that the fathers in both of those stories are willing to say, here's my daughter, take them, rape them, do whatever you wish to it. And why are you comfortable with the expendability of women and the availability of women's sexuality and the capacity of a father to control his daughter's sexuality to the extent that he could just trade it away that easily? Why are you so comfortable with that? But you become uncomfortable with a sincere expression of devotion between two people of the same sex. So that there are a bunch of different things that are working within our minds that lead us to read and interpret biblical texts and allow some texts the kind of free rein that we have given them. And much of this tends to be this heterosexual construct that which we have brought to the text. I want to say here much of what to unpack a little bit further some of what I was talking about is that when we read the Hebrew Bible, we're reading from a culture that then allows men greater sexual freedom than it does women. So for instance, men could acquire multiple wives. And you see this, Abraham, Joseph, Moses, Samuel, Hannah's husband, Elkanah, right? A whole number of different ones. It's there. And so that's within the context of the Hebrew Bible. Multiple wives. And there's no place that says you should not do this or you should do it. It all depended upon the economic capacity of the man, if he could afford it. And again, one of the issues of the heterosexual construct that we see people bringing to the Bible is that they try to force monogamy into all of these types of relationships when they're certainly not there. So there are these privileges. Men had a lot more freedom to engage in sexual activity than women did. Women's sexuality, on the other hand, was much more circumscribed. We see this in Deuteronomy 22 in a series of legislation that circumscribe women's sexuality and women's sexual expressions and the ways in which women needed to prove that they were virgins, whatever that means, in some ways. And a lot of what these issues around virginity or this construct of virginity reveals is the way in which men need to trade in women. And by trade, I don't necessarily mean sex trafficking. I mean the kinds of social relationships that men have with one another in terms of exchanging women. Notice in Deuteronomy 22, the place of the father in those stories. Because our father's interest is to get rid of his daughters as quickly as he possibly can. And the way in which men moved their daughters is an interesting thing. I already talked about what happens in Genesis chapter 19. You could read in Judges chapter 1 how Othniel basically says, hey, I have as we see in fairy tales, we have this huge problem with this fight. If somebody comes forward, helps us to win, here's a daughter, you could get her. Right? The way in which women then became quite expendable, and that's part of the traffic. And men wanted to be sure that when they exchanged their daughters to another man, that the exchange value was there. The man, on the other hand, who was receiving it, wanted to make sure that what he received and the children that came from that woman were always his. Because yes, there's certain biological orientations to say, yeah, once I realize that my genes are being reproduced and replicated and there are all of these ways they will stay on in the world, I will invest my resources into it. A man did not want to invest his resources into raising and perpetuating another man's genes or genetic makeup. So there are all of these things that are there to, in some ways, kind of regulate that trading and trafficking in women. And so women had a lot more of their lives circumscribed. So of course, men within that framework had a little bit more freedom to choose. There were prohibitions against them encroaching the rights of another man over a woman. So if the woman was married, they couldn't do that. If the woman's father was there or older brothers, they couldn't do that. But women who were unattached, sex workers who freed themselves from the control of men, foreign women who were walking through a community without men, widows who had no husbands or anything like that, those women were free reign. So men could have sexual relations with those women. You see some of the advice in Proverbs, see the way in which the men are thinking about Ruth in the book of Ruth, because she's an unattached widow that came in without kinds of protections. Those are the kinds of values that exist within this construct, and a lot of it, in some ways, is a presumption of men having most of the privileges. I want to close, though, by pointing out one of the places where this heterosexual construct tends to emerge is within this notion of the term Sodom, and the way in which we understand the term Sodom and sort of representative terms like sodomite and sodomy, etc., etc. So one of the things we'll see within the King James Version, printed in, published in 1611, is that the term sodomite appears, but it never appears as an evaluation of the people of Sodom or any activity related to Genesis 19. In fact, the term in the King James Version, and I have three references there, loosely translates the term kedeshim, which in some ways means cult prostitute. And this was a way to talk about various kinds of what was seen as immoral practices related to other deities. So there's a sense in which, I think, we think there's some kind of sexual activity going on in that temple, or those people in that who worship that God, they do some kind of a sexual thing. And there was never, as you read these passages, there never is it male on male? Is it women on women? Is it male? It was that they were just immoral. So this is just very generic term, and sodomite became the term that was used in the English translation. And so a very interesting history within the English language itself, had certainly within the 16th, 17th century and before. It's never in some ways a way to talk specifically about one particular kind of sexual practices, but it was a term that lumped all together. And we see within the broader discourse of the Protestant Reformation, Sodom as a catchword for a place that incurs divine wrath and divine judgment. Sodom becomes a way for the Protestants to talk about Catholics. And there were ways in which they would use it metaphorically to reference whether it's adultery, fornication, and yes, in some instances, in same-sex relations. But again, it was never that targeted and focused in some ways. By the time we get into the early 20th century, biblical translations are paying attention to the kinds of development in psychology and therapeutic sciences. And there are certain movements that are happening in the field related to same-sex and same-gender relationships. And a term like homosexuals enters into the lexicon. And it enters into the RSV translations. And there's no way in which it enters into the Hebrew Bible translations, but we'll see it turning up more or less in New Testament translations, particularly 1 Corinthians 6, and then of course in Romans 1, as well as another place where it turns up. And why I'm mentioning this here is the way in which those New Testament translations and those New Testament ideas gain currency from the way in which people are reading Genesis 19. So that this is the important thing that I'm talking about, how in some ways this term becomes an invented term as a way of interpreting Genesis chapter 19, and then making it not just simply a term of opprobrium, but pointing to a very specific set of sexual ideas. These pathways of interpretations are important for us to pay attention to. Because again, as I started, the pathway is about reaffirming a heterosexual construct, a presumption that this is natural and this is the way in which it works. And then you garner these different pieces to pull together an edifice for saying, here is how this becomes rational and intelligible across the Hebrew Bible. When I think more or less when you start to apply what we would regard as normative sexual values today, we would be hard pressed to agree with a lot of what we are reading. All right, so that's what I have to say. Paul, I'll end it there. I think I've said enough. I've given you, if you got the handout, some material that I read in preparation for this, and if you get them, that'll be good for you. Okay, so Paul.
Thank you, Steed, I'm having a computer problem right now, friends, and that's why I'm on my phone. So we're now going to a time of questions if you have for Steed. I'm gonna ask Eleanor, I've made you co-host, if you could guide us through this point. If you have a question, you could just put up your hand virtually or real, and Eleanor will call on you and unmute yourself and direct your questions to Steed. Eleanor, if you could help me here, please.
I am looking across the board here. I don't have cameras on, so it might be hard for me to see if you have your hand raised unless you're doing the Zoom version here.
Might be good if everyone turns on their camera now. Now turn back on your camera, your videos.
I am not seeing any hands raised, Reverend Paul, at this particular point.
But I have one question. If I'm hearing you correctly, Steed, we really can't be using the Hebrew Scriptures, Old Testament, as a sort of handbook for guiding the question of sexual relations. But yet still it's used so often. And so I am puzzled. What drives this desire to use the and forgive the Old Testament in this way?
Because what you have are forceful texts. The use that you refer to occurs by people who can say the Bible says, and so you have what some of the ones I referred to here. So you have Genesis 1, you have Genesis 2, you have Leviticus 18, right? So between that, you could say the Bible says, the Bible says, the Bible says, and invoke that particular kind of authority. And quite often, this is what you get. You get the Bible says, and what the Bible and what follows is hardly ever what's actually written there. Right? Are these, like I say, presumptions about what is there and the conclusions people have come to about what is written there. So when you're in a context where the Bible is the authoritative text and an authoritative voice that is guiding that conversation, you will have that. Because one of the things that we have not figured out to do well is to actually say, there are parts of this book, or maybe this book can guide us in several different ways. And because we are not saying that, in all the places where it matters, people feel emboldened to use it in that way. That is, hear me saying it, we will, so to the extent that we invoke, here it happens when in a marriage ceremony, in the liturgy of the marriage ceremony, we invoke the Garden of Eden and invoke it as the first marriage. Really? I'm not too sure that I see any marriage taking place there, right? In Hebrew Bible, we can't talk about marriage in the Hebrew Bible in the way in which we understand marriage in our society today. But because we have given the past to equate those two things, those two worlds in this wonderful time of a marriage ceremony, implicitly we have also said you could invoke it as an authoritative source to then combat what you think to be something that is incompatible with the divine purposes.
I would like to say something.
Yep. Peter.
Yes, my name is Peter, and I'm a licensed lay worship leader within the United Church. And I find that growing up, of course, people use scriptures to tell me what I could and couldn't do, right? And express my sexuality. But I find as a worship leader, I really have to be careful what I'm reading. And I have to, if I'm picking a certain text from the Bible, I have to, go in really deep and find out what exactly happened during that time in history. And because the Bible isn't written by people that certain things happened at that time. So, I mean, it really changes what it means.
Yeah. Right. In other words, you are concerned that you could be in some ways scripturalizing or authorizing something that could be harmful to you, or a perspective that's harmful to you.
Exactly.
Yeah,
because you could put your own biases into it, right? Because people read scripture and they say, oh yeah, this reminds me of blah, 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 which may not have anything to do with that scripture. Yeah. And I think as church people, we have to be very careful.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and so one of the things that we have to keep asking is because we may not be able to eliminate that from happening. But if the experience or the way in which it is done is to oppress, to exclude, to hurt, to harm, then you have to say, maybe this thing ain't as life-giving as I thought it would be, right? So there is one experience when you might create a bias, and what it does, it offers some liberation and it frees someone. Then you may say, that can't be too bad. Even if it may not have been that way, even if what I am doing could not be justified, the impact of giving life to someone is fine. But it's a very different thing when the effect is to take away and to take away life. Then you're starting to ask the question, are you now working alongside of God? Are you working with God's purposes? If you are using this thing from God to then destroy someone else or destroy other people or to harm a whole group of people, those will be the kinds of, I guess, ethical questions that we have to then bring to bear.
Are there any other questions or
Oops.
Reverend Paul, are you available?
No, I don't think he's back yet.
Yeah. I'm the black box.
yeah. Well, while we work today, what would be some of were there concerns that are present within your conversation that I may not have addressed, or the things that you have found, oh my gosh, I have been trying to have these conversations with some people, and they're difficult. So what has been your experience? Or I'm curious, because Paul didn't tell me this, because you went through the reconciling process recently. How did those conversations go for you? Were they helpful, frustrating? Did you gain insight or not into thing, or yeah?
I am back on my phone. Also, I think I've missed part or much part. Steve, I heard Peter's query, and as you were speaking, for me, the question comes again. We have taken so much of the Bible for granted, and we have taken it almost as it has been handed to us. But it would seem that in some ways we need to rethink our perspective on the Bible and rethink how we understand the Bible.
Let's see if we have.
No, I'm saying I think there's need for us to go again to look at Scripture, and something that we have taken for granted, we need to rethink.
Yes. Yeah. Right. I wasn't too sure whether you were finished or not. Definitely. There's always a need for rethinking, and in some ways, I think go back to your earlier statement that we do with it as we have been given, as it has been handed to us. And if we understand Scripture as a process of traditioning, it's in one sense we safeguard it so that the thing remains. In another sense, we make it usable to hand it on. And the dominant view tends to be, I need to protect this and not change it, and then give it to the next generation. That is a fairly modern development. Maybe 19th century, some would argue, or early 20th century is what we started to see some of those ideas coming in terms of the way people were approaching Scripture. I mean, if you kind of think through the Protestant Reformation, it was precisely one of those. This was one of those areas that comes up, and what the Protestant Reformation was like was in some ways saying, we need to have a biblical text translated into our own languages so that we could hear what's going on. Here is something that was just foreign to us, and people didn't know what it meant. And so if you take something that and make it your own, and it enters into a language that you have, it then can be transmitted in a very different way. Of course, the problem that I'm raising here is a result of all of those Protestant movements that basically said, no, we need to stop this. We need to lock this thing down. But the Bible was always, in some sense, seen as open-ended for a very long time, seen as open-ended, and that you received and you passed on. And what you were passing on was not necessarily what you received, but your responsibility was to pass something on because you made it meaningful and useful, and it had to be passed on generally so that they could do that work. I think the reality is, given the way in which the sort of general perspective upon the Bible within the church is that we have created an ossified product that's hard to transmit. If there's no kind of liveliness or relevance for it in the present, It doesn't have it. It can't be transmitted later on. So that's part of the rethinking that you're talking about, of making it relevant in order so that it can be transmitted.
I see Beth's hand.
One of our founders of the Christian church, John Wesley, used a quadrilateral to explain the things that would be accepted by the Christian church, and it was there were 4 points to it: the scripture, tradition, the tradition of the common people, reason, and then experience. And I have been in the church for nearly 80 years, and I just found this out about John Wesley a few months ago, and I was dumbfounded that one of the founders that I held in high regard would actually allow us to use reason and experience in order to shape our Christian views of life. Is that because, are we moving into an area in the Christian church where we are permitting ourselves to say to one another, it doesn't make common sense that we are surrounded by loving, kind, good people who are gays and lesbians, and the church is blocking them from a full welcome into our congregation? Why have we not embraced this idea of John Wesley is one of the only leaders, but the idea that he would embrace reason and experience as a valid criteria to accept people into the faith.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you learned that, and it's a fantastic observation, given that it is several hundred years old at this point in time, and you would have thought, wow, we should have been further along with that type of an insight. And it's interesting to see conversations taking place in certain Methodist communions as if that never is not a foundational thought. So the innovative contribution that Wesley makes there is on the question of experience.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are other people were doing different pieces of this, but he added that fourth one, which was experience. And sometimes I draw attention to the fact that Wesley is saying Christian experience. So not necessarily experience writ large, but how have you experienced God? I think it's one of the big touchstones that we have to ask ourselves when we do certain things or think through certain things. And as you're pointing out, if you have persons who are engaged in a sincere, faithful set of love and commitment to one another, and they happen to be of opposite sex, opposite genders, opposite races, opposite languages, opposite whatever, all of those kinds of a thing. What would a loving God do? Basically say, no, you shouldn't love each other because you're too different, or you're too alike, or you're too the same. What would and one has to ask the question, how have you experienced God? How have you experienced God as an obstacle to love? Have you experienced God as putting stumbling blocks in the ways of people? Have you been, and so these are the kinds of questions that I think that quadrilateral gets us and forces us to come to terms with. And I think I'm mindful of the language that you're using, because I think the language that you're using is very reflective of a lot of conversations that's going on in church. It's the language of access and blockages. It's the language of gatekeeping, because a lot of people use this, and I hear you channeling their thinking and their speaking, because then we have to ask ourselves, when we now decide that we will be the gatekeepers on behalf of God, are we actually doing it based upon how we have experienced God? Is this the God we have experienced, that then, rather than making the gate wide, makes it narrow, rather than including, excludes, right? And rather than say, oh, here's this one taint, oops, sorry, can't get it, because you got to be pure and perfect, got to stay out. Or all of those different types of criteria, not just on the matter of gender and sexuality, that we tend to set up, and it's to say, oh, no, this is normal, you're not, so those types of conversations can be very, very problematic, because what is absent from them is that issue, like I said, not just of experience, but Christian experience, asking, who is the God you have experienced? Is what you're teaching compatible with it?
Yeah. I heard a story of a young boy. He was Catholic, very devoted boy, and he went for communion. And as he knelt for communion in that Catholic church, he asked God, he said, God was the only one that I could trust with my question. And I asked God, why have you made me this way? Why have you made me different than everybody else? And I was so moved by that story, that little boy would turn to God in his innocence and say, why have you made me this way?
Right. And I think, a church community should be the place where somebody gets to experience God in that way, rather than being the one that then prevents that experience from happening, or shuts it down, or dismisses it, delegitimizes it with certain types of statements. Not too sure how that story turned out for him, but just that the space existed within that community where he felt able to do it. Good, thank you.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks everyone for participating. We are going to, unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. Steve, your presentation was not only good, it was necessary. It has left much food for thought, and I'm certain that many of us will want to revisit this presentation and reflect further, and I'm certain that more discussion will come out of this presentation as we move on. So thanks very much for helping us to look at the Hebrew scriptures in a new way, and to continue our own understanding of the Bible, not as an old, dusty book that is lost in ages and has no relevance, but it's still a book when properly interpreted. Wesley's point was that the Bible needs to be interpreted properly. It offers to us much fodder and life and light for our present journey. So thanks very much, Steve, for this, and please know that we truly appreciate the time you have taken to be present with us.
Okay, thank you. You're quite welcome. Good night, everyone.
Thank you so
Friends,
much.
Friends, before we go, this recording will be uploaded tonight, and Reverend Davidson has given us a handout, and if you are interested in receiving the handout, please do get in touch with our church office tomorrow, and it will be sent out to you. Our church office, FSPC at shaw.ca. All of this will come to you in a web blast tonight from Zoom. But let's keep the conversation going. There is indeed need for the conversation to keep going. So thank you all. Pleasant night. And as we would say in Jamaica, walk good.